Alrighty, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for virtually joining the 8th Annual Delaware River Watershed Forum. My name is Kelly Knudsen. I'm the State Policy Manager with the Coalition of the Delaware River Watershed. Today, you're joining the session, Riparian Buffer and Floodplain Policies and Practices. Just a couple housekeeping things before we dive into the speakers. The session is recorded and it will be posted to our website early next week. That way, if you want to view it at a later date, you certainly can, as well as other folks that couldn't attend, it will be accessible to them. Everyone is muted at this moment. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you do have a question later on. We're going to hold all questions to the end after each of the speakers, but also feel free to utilize the chat box. That way you can answer any questions and queue them up for the speakers as well. If you are having any technical difficulties, do let me know via the chat box. Again, Kelly Knudsen, and happy to assist and help in any way I can. And we also are promoting all of our schedule of events through sketch.com. It's a great way to kind of keep up to date and let us know which sessions you may be attending throughout the whole event. At this moment, I'll pass it over to Jen Adkins. Thanks, everyone.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Kelly. So my name is Jen Adkins. I am the Director of the Clean Water Supply in the Mid-Atlantic for American Rivers. And I'm going to be serving as your moderator, playing the moderator role today. So Eileen and Josh are going to be doing the heavy lifting in terms of presenting, but you'll hear from me at the beginning and the end. And so the first thing I'd like to do is invite them each to introduce themselves. Eileen, if you want to go first.
Sure, thanks, Jen. I'm Eileen Shader. I'm Director of Floodplain Restoration for American Rivers. I lead our national program working to build capacity for equitable and integrated floodplain management that prioritizes nature-based approaches. I am a certified floodplain manager. I work at the intersection of floodplain management and the conservation communities, so trying to find the overlap there and align those two communities towards shared goals. I live outside of Harrisburg now, but I did grow up in the Poconos, and my favorite place in the world is Appenzell Creek, which is in the Broadhead watershed, and it flows through my parents' backyard. So I'm excited to be a part of this week's forum and engage with all of you that work on the Delaware River.
Great, and I'm Josh Lippert. I'm the floodplain manager here in the city of Philadelphia, where I currently reside. I was formerly the floodplain manager and environmental planner for the city of Pittsburgh, and know the western part of the state very well, as I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, but like Eileen, grew up in a floodplain in the northwestern part of the state on the French Creek in Pennsylvania, and I'm happy to be here today and present.
Great. Next slide. So just to get us started, a little bit about American Rivers, if there's anyone out there who doesn't know us. We are working to protect wild rivers, restoring damaged rivers, and conserving clean water for people and nature, as you can see on this slide. And we recognize that all three of the things that you see here, healthy ecosystems, thriving communities, and clean water, are critical for healthy rivers, and also that healthy rivers connect all of these things. And so we have people on staff who are focused on ecosystem restoration, like Eileen, and then we have some other folks on staff who are focused more on clean water, like myself, but in many cases we're working together across those topical areas. Next. And we also do work at both the national level and at the local level. So this is a map just looking at the country and showing the primary priority watersheds where we work across the country. And you can see, if you look at the Mid-Atlantic here, if you can see that, we have two priority watersheds that we're working in. One, of course, is the Delaware River Basin, which we're talking about here today, but also the Chesapeake Bay River Basin. And we also do have our national headquarters in Washington, D.C., where we also have some folks who work on national policy. But so Eileen and I are both here in the Mid-Atlantic. But she also looks at floodplain restoration nationally. So she's not focused just at Pennsylvania, although a lot of what we're talking about today will have a distinctly Pennsylvania flavor to it, for sure. Next. So just to briefly touch on our agenda and what we want to cover today. First, what are floodplains and riparian buffers and how do they benefit communities? And Eileen is going to kick us off talking about that. And then what is floodplain management and what do river conservationists need to know about floodplain regulations? And Josh is going to give us a sort of floodplain 101 to look at that. And then we'd like to kind of all come back together and give you some of our thoughts on opportunities for integrating floodplain management and river conservation in the Delaware River Basin. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for your questions and to have some discussion at the end. Next. So Eileen is going to get us started.
All right. So the inspiration for this session really came from an issue that folks were facing in Pennsylvania and in other states, particularly in the East Coast over the past couple of years. Basically, when communities were trying to plant riparian buffers in order to improve stream health, they were hearing it from FEMA, the agency responsible for setting floodplain regulations, that they were going to have to undertake some expensive hydrology studies in order to plant those trees, which, if you are familiar with that process, can be very expensive, very burdensome. So we wanted to try and address this issue. We are working at the national level with FEMA in order to try and come to develop some national level solutions, but that's going to take some time. In the meantime, we wanted to use this opportunity to start bringing floodplain managers and river conservationists together in order to learn from each other, understand what our different groups work on, so that we can more effectively and cooperatively work in the floodplain. And I should also mention that this isn't just about buffers. The same challenges have come up with other projects, whether it's dam removal, stream restoration, trail projects. They all have to comply with floodplain regulations. So it's important to know the different issues that your floodplain manager may be concerned about in the areas you're working. Next slide. So what is a floodplain? In short, it's the area that's going next to a river or stream that's going to be inundated during a flood and during high flows. There's a lot of overlap and between floodplains, riparian zones, wetlands. It's not always distinct. The terminology can be confusing for some people, but for today's purposes, just understand that floodplains are those areas inundated during a flood. That area is going to change based on the size of the flood. And as you will hear from Josh later, floodplain managers have a much more specific definition based on the 1% annual chance flood, or as many people have heard it referred to as the 100-year flood. Next slide. Both floodplains and riparian buffers provide a wide range of services supporting both land and water functions by enhancing or maintaining water quality, habitats, and resilience. In floodplain management, we call these the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains. Integrated or multi-benefit floodplain management focuses on trying to achieve two goals: reducing flood risk and damages, and preserving and restoring the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains. So all of those characteristics such as water quality, improved habitat, et cetera, based on whatever the needs are of your local community, what you're trying to accomplish and achieve from your floodplain. Next. So what do we need to know about riparian vegetation and its role in flooding? Well, first, during floods, we see a lot of erosion as fast-moving streams can eat away at their banks, and riparian vegetation helps to reduce that erosion and minimizes downcutting within streams. Next. Further up in a watershed, buffers and vegetation can help to absorb the runoff, and they slow how quickly the water flows downstream, which helps to reduce flood peaks. So having robust vegetation throughout the watershed, always great for reducing flood damages. But natural and natural and undeveloped floodplains can help to safely convey floodwaters. So if you don't have homes and you don't have properties in the floodplain, there's no risk of them being damaged. As the water spreads out across the floodplain, it slows down, it reduces in flood heights. So that helps to reduce the damages as you're going downstream. And vegetation can play a key role in slowing down those floodwaters, further reducing the speed at which the water flows across the landscape. Next. However, from a floodplain management perspective, they have to be concerned that too much riparian vegetation in a stream channel can reduce the carrying capacity of that channel. So essentially, the vegetation, having trees, lots of bushes there, can displace water, then resulting in higher flood heights. They also have to be concerned about abundant vegetation on the floodplain, which can affect where water flows, particularly if there are a lot of downed trees that could direct water to buildings or infrastructure and then increase damage. So this is where that issues with the H&H studies that I mentioned come into play. When flood maps are being created, engineers have to do models that show where the water is going to flow, and part of that process involves picking what's called a roughness coefficient, or an estimate of how much vegetation will be on the floodplain. If the map and the model and the map don't account for the changes in that vegetation, then the map won't necessarily account for how that change will affect the flow. So that can get much more complicated, and I am not the engineer or hydrologist, but just gives you a sense of what they need to be concerned about. Next slide. So that said, we have to plant buffers, we have to do river conservation, and we have to make sure that people and communities are safe from flooding. Across the country, we are seeing a growing interest and support from floodplain managers who are interested in nature-based solutions that can give rivers more room to safely convey floodwaters and to restore their rivers and streams to more natural conditions. So at the end of the presentation, we're going to cover some ways that conservationists and floodplain managers can work together. But I think that understanding each other's goals and perspectives is the important first step. So that is why I invited my colleague Josh, the floodplain manager for the city of Philadelphia, to give us a little floodplain 101 today. So from here, I will turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Eileen. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about floodplain management in the context of riparian buffers. Next slide. And to start, I just want to talk about what floodplain management is. It is a community-based effort to prevent and reduce the risk of flooding, resulting in a more resilient community. Next slide. And these are just the types of flooding that we experience in Pennsylvania. This slide shows riverine, dams, hurricanes and tropical storms, and rainfall. Next slide. Which shows urban and infrastructure flooding, sea level rise, the Philadelphia International Airport, which is expected to be inundated by year 2100, as well as tidal and lake flooding. Just shows that flooding isn't one size fits all. Next slide. Just to start off the presentation today, specifically in the context of Floodplain Management 101, can't start anywhere but talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, which was created in the late 60s. As a way to provide flood insurance, but it also has risk identification through mapping, management through regulations, and then, as I stated, one of the most prevalent pieces is the insurance that it provides, being that 1 inch of floodwaters can cause upwards of $20,000 worth of damage to properties. Next slide. Participation in the National Flood Insurance Program in Pennsylvania is mandatory, but can be voluntary in other parts of the country. By participating in the program, you must adopt and enforce compliant regulations. So here in Pennsylvania, that is through the state's model ordinance, where it provides benefits is the fact that anyone within those jurisdictions who participate in the NFIP can acquire flood insurance, no matter if you're in a floodplain or outside of a floodplain. Those jurisdictions also can get grants and loans in terms of flood mitigation. and they can get disaster assistance in the event of a flood disaster. And then finally, one of the most important aspects is that people that buy and sell properties with mortgages or federally banked loans can get mandatory flood insurance for those properties. So properties can be bought and sold without paying cash. Next slide. So the role of a floodplain manager can vary depending on the jurisdiction that you're within. In general, they help adopt and regulate floodplains through permits and adopted codes and regulations. They also can have a more varied role within a jurisdiction. They can provide training and education, coordination with state and federal agencies. They can work with the planning department to provide land use planning in relation to floodplains. They can also work on mitigation projects, whether it's building dams, naturalization of historic floodplains. And then finally, they can also provide preparedness, response, and recovery activities within those jurisdictions. Next slide. If you're interested in how to contact your floodplain manager, in Pennsylvania, we have a MuniStats page where you can find every type of government officer, whether it's the zoning administrator or the floodplain manager for each specific county. So this is just a link in a website that exists here in Pennsylvania and similar to other states around the country. Next slide. So in the context of the National Flood Insurance Program, this is a typical cross-section. This cross-section represents the special flood hazard area, which is minimally regulated under any NFIP participating community. This cross-section represents the 1% annual chance flood, formerly known as the 100-year floodplain. And it incorporates both the floodway, which you see in the middle, which is typically the stream channel, and then on either side, the flood fringe, which is predominantly where we see development occurring within the floodplain. Next slide. So how do you know your flood risk? This is the mapping and the science. Next slide. In Pennsylvania, we're lucky enough to have almost our entire state covered by digital maps. So this is a screenshot of the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. Much like Google, you just type in an address and an interactive screen pops up at the bottom. If you click on the magnifying glass, next slide, it'll actually print you an 8.5 by 11 exhibit that shows your specific address in context to the special flood hazard area. Excuse me. On this map, you'll see a variety of various shaded colors. The hatched red and blue, which is where the dark stream channel is here in Philadelphia, is shown as the floodway, or otherwise the stream channel. And then on either side of that, you see the flood fringe highlighted in blue. That blue area, as well as the hatch area, represent that special flood hazard area, or the 1%, otherwise known as the 100-year floodplain. In the orange is the 0.2% chance, known as the 500-year floodplain, which is not regulated under the minimal regulations in the NFIP, but can be adopted as a higher regulation at local jurisdictions. And then the unshaded areas are areas of minimal flood risk. Next slide. In addition to the flood insurance rate maps, which were shown on the previous slide, there's also the flood insurance study, which incorporates the effective hydrologic models as well as cross sections. So this is an illustrative cross section of a flood insurance study that shows the stream channel and then the base flood elevations to the nearest 10th decimal point. Next slide. And then finally, I wanted to just talk about coastal flood hazard areas. This is a coastal flood insurance rate map that does not have a designated floodway, this one being along the Delaware River here in Philadelphia. It actually has a black line with triangles that represents moderate wave action. So these are areas that are tidally influenced or even coastally influenced, depending on which part of the riverine conditions you're on. Next slide. And then there's also A zones. These are a lot of zones in rural America and even rural Pennsylvania. These are zones that are identified as hazard areas, but do not have the data behind them to identify base flow elevations. Next slide. And then finally, not regulated, but needs to be part of the science behind some of the decision-making in floodplain management is future conditions. These are just two products that exist locally here in the Philadelphia and larger region of Pennsylvania that show the effects of climate change, specifically sea level rise, both through a NOAA product as well as through our product through our regional planning organization. Next slide. So getting into permitting your project. This is where I'm going to dive a little bit more deeper into the regulations. So I like to start with the definition of development. Development definitions in floodplains are rather unique because they go beyond just traditional zoning and building definitions. They're not only just for new construction, renovation projects, or addition projects. It's also for the temporary structures, as well as temporary or permanent storage. So things like mulch piles, log piles, even planting trees is considered development within the context of floodplain regulations. Next slide. To really understand the context of regulations, I like to bring up this chart that shows there's the national regulations, the NFIP regulations through the 44 CFR. There are then local floodplain regulations. Those can be found in your zoning ordinances, a standalone floodplain ordinance, sometimes in your stormwater codes or even health codes. And then in a lot of cases, localities would also tie in their building codes, specifically standards in Appendix G of the IBC, but also the structural standards in ASE 7, and then the really holistic higher standards found in ASE 24. So together, this is what you need to look at when in terms of the regulatory context. Next slide. So if you're in, near, or adjacent to a waterway, almost always federal and state permits apply to these projects. Local permitting occurs after federal and state permits are obtained. Almost always there's a need to do hydrologic and hydraulic analyses or coastal analysis, depending on if you're in a riverine or coastal condition. And then almost always a FEMA letter of map change is required. These are required to update the risk on a flood insurance rate map to the physical changes that are occurring. So whether it's a new structure, if it's a riparian restoration project or floodplain restoration project, they may cause floodplain boundary changes, base flood elevation changes, flood hazard zone changes, or even change those cross sections within an FIS study. And it's regardless of whether you're doing increased capacity in a floodplain, lowering the BFE, or even raising the BFE. Next slide. There's also some general concepts if you're going beyond just naturalization projects. Elevating above the BFE, in general, that's 12 inches above. In Pennsylvania, we've adopted 18 inches above that base flood elevation. There's also concepts of wet versus dry flood proofing, depending on the types of structures that you're constructing. And then almost always using flood damage resistant materials for those structures that are located in floodplains. Next slide. Accessory structures are important for stream restoration projects that include recreational facilities, examples of storage facilities that might store the tools and materials to maintain those stream buffers, or restroom facilities do need to meet the accessory structures requirements. Next slide. Machinery and equipment, this includes lighting. So if there are trails with lights or other facilities, making sure that those light posts are anchored, and making sure any of those transformer or generators that are associated with that equipment are elevated and anchored, so that it does reduce cost and repair after flood events. Next slide. Storage of materials is equally important, and also one of the most common non-compliance that occurs around the country. Things like storage of clean fill or mulch piles or log piles are generally not permitted in floodplains. Here in Philadelphia, we have lots of junkyards that are not permitted. However, if you do have movable furniture or things that can be moved without mechanical assistance, you would just require an operations plan to move those out of the flood's path. Next slide. Temporary structures are equally important. Things like wedding tents, shown on the top image, do need to be regulated if located in a floodplain. Things like food trucks, if they're located in the floodplain for longer than a certain period of time, and even porta-johns are considered development in floodplains and would also need to be regulated. Next slide. Shipping containers and trailers. The image of the shipping containers is actually right here in Philadelphia. You can see the skyline peeking in the background. These shipping containers are located here as as housing and storage materials, kayaks and other recreational and tools to maintain this facility along the Schuylkill River. These containers are in non-compliant status because they are not anchored and secured properly in a floodplain and could become buoyant and become damaging materials if floating downstream during a flood event. Next slide. And I also wanted to conclude with some best practices in terms of coordination. It's always important when working in, near, or adjacent to waterways to coordinate with all of your state and federal partners as a floodplain manager and as a project applicant. We're fortunate to have an organization called the Urban Waterfront Action Group here in Philadelphia that provides a one-stop kind of conceptual review of projects with all of the federal, state, and local permitters. Next slide. There's also some best practices around the nation. There's the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines from the Waterfront Alliance, which promote flood resiliency, ecology, and access to waterways. Very much like a LEED certification program, it certifies projects that meet certain standards towards resiliency, ecology, and access. In New York City, there's an amazing document that sort of downsamples floodplain regulations to parks and recreational and trail facilities. This was developed after Hurricane Sandy because there was just devastating amounts of repair and replacement costs to a lot of NYC park facilities. And then locally here in Pennsylvania, we have some really great work coming out of DCNR as well as PennDOT that they're doing extreme weather vulnerability studies and assessments that will eventually lead to some guidelines for streets and trails here in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Also want to talk about a few precedent projects. This slide is not every trail or restoration project is a good project in terms of floodplain management, although it might have great benefits for connectivity and habitat restoration. There's a wetland park proposed here that is proposing upland type ecology. However, it would totally destroy mudflats that are high ecological value. It also has some detrimental impacts potentially to the floodplain along the Delaware River by adding fill to create that upland habitat. We also have a huge trail project that's proposed that actually is increasing flood elevations at certain aspects and requires dredging as a mitigation type to implement that project. Next slide. And then bringing this to a more rural context, the next two slides show some rural floodplain mitigation projects. This is one in Manheim, Pennsylvania, where you can see based off of the flood map in the bottom left, they did not pursue a letter of map revision. So after the project was completed, it appears that the flood map was not updated and does not reflect the flood risk associated with this restoration project. Whereas on the next slide, we see another project in Pennsylvania in Lancaster County, where there was a flood restoration project that incorporated the data into the effective FEMA maps. You can see with that blue line around the map that the maps were updated to show the physical risk based off of the physical alterations that were completed as part of this project. Next slide. And then finally, there are a lot of professional organizations that can assist with anyone doing work within floodplains. There's the Association of State Floodplain Managers, the national organization. And then right here in Pennsylvania, I'm actually the vice chair of the Pennsylvania Floodplain Managers organization. We provide an annual conference, newsletters. We offer certified floodplain managers exams. We also provide a host of resources and webinars, such as Floodplain Management 101. Next slide. And now I think I'm going to hand it back over to Jen.
Thanks, Josh. So that was a tremendous amount of some really good information. And next, what we'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some opportunities that we see for integrating floodplain management and river conservation in the basin. And actually, I think, Josh, you're going to be up next again. Next.
So these are some considerations. These are my pro tips from my time, both in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, as well as my background as a landscape architect. Always look to develop a watershed plan with a floodplain management component. I can't tell you how many times I've seen waterfront plans or watershed plans that focus on CSO reduction, but don't have a strong focus on floodplain management. So if you can, start at that planning level to develop and integrate floodplain management regulations. It's also very important to hire design professionals that are knowledgeable of floodplain regulations. It's a systemic problem nationally. There are a lot of design professionals that just aren't aware of the locally adopted regulations, whether it be in building codes or zoning codes. So make sure that you hire someone that has that expertise to bring to your project. Also, always start with analyzing flood maps, climate science, even historic flood data is important to look at in the context of a project. It's also equally important to review the local regulations, not just knowing the minimum standards, but looking at the higher standards that may be adopted in that local jurisdiction that you're working in. It's also important, if you can, to communicate with your local floodplain manager. I will say, in a lot of rural parts of America, and specifically Pennsylvania, the floodplain manager may wear multiple hats. They may even be a volunteer employee for that locality. So if you can't reach a floodplain manager, reach out to the state. The state always has a state NFIP coordinator. Equally, coordinate with your federal and state agencies. It's never too early in a project to coordinate with the Army Corps, as well as the DEP here in Pennsylvania. Those are two vital permitting agencies when you're in, near, or adjacent to waterways. It's also important to obtain floodplain permits. Localities need to maintain documentation and permits in order to stay compliant in the NFIP to provide that insurance in those mitigation grants to their locality. So always make sure that you're obtaining those permits and documenting those at the local level. Some other kind of additional things to think about: prepare flood emergency operations plans. So whether it's a maintenance plan or if you have recreational facilities, make sure you're aware of things that you can do to minimize the effects of flooding at your specific properties. And then, as always, maintain your projects before, during, and after a flood events. Remove some of that extra vegetation or the vegetation that is dead or has become debris so that floodwaters can flow freely in the event of a flood. So those are my pro tips for floodplain management and riparian buffers.
Okay, thanks, Josh. So a couple of opportunities in regard to buffers and floodplains. Certainly there are always opportunities, well, not always, but often there are opportunities for improving buffer policies, as well as looking at all these floodplain policies. You don't necessarily need to read this table, but it's summarizing in a really simplistic way different policies across the watershed, looking across the states in the Delaware River Basin, and really just aims at pointing out that there are a variety of different policies when it comes to buffers across states. And then in this case, in Delaware, the policies are at the county level as opposed to the state level. And then what's not shown here on top of all of this is that you can always also have policies at the local level, at the municipal level, which is particularly important in Pennsylvania with all our local municipalities. So next. And so at the municipal level, there are some very good resources around buffer policies, including information on overlay districts and model ordinances. One of those resources that I think is really helpful is the Pennsylvania Land Trust Association. PALTA's website has a whole series of model ordinances and overlay district work that you can look at for opportunities to encourage buffers and manage buffers at the local level. Also, as part of stormwater management in the MS4 program, buffer protection, buffer restoration, and floodplain restoration are all BMPs that are recognized for stormwater management in Pennsylvania in the manual there. So, and then also there are a wide range, which we won't get into today, but just know that there are a wide range of programs out there for funding buffer restoration programs that can also be applied for buffers in the floodplain. So next. Another opportunity that we see that we've been looking at American Rivers and Clean Water Supply is opportunities for buffers to support recreation. And I think this goes for floodplains too, particularly when we're talking about passive recreation. I mean, these areas along our riverways, things can get really complicated with buffers or with floodplains when we're talking about development and hard structures. And so ideally, having these areas set aside for recreation is one of the ways to not have as many of those conflicts, although as Josh pointed out, there still are considerations for recreation if you're putting things, including planting trees in floodways. But the opportunities to support recreation from buffers are huge, ranging from clean water and fish and wildlife habitat, which most people who are recreating on rivers care about, to things like shade and cooling, erosion control, and even framing views along walkways along river areas. And then also wildlife management, safety, and having stable access are all ways that buffers can support recreation. Next. On the flip side, people who are doing the recreation can also support buffers, and I think there's a big need for that, and support good floodplain management. So looking at things like minimizing gaps when it comes to buffers for water quality is important, clearly. Avoiding steep and sensitive areas, stabilizing access points, minimizing vegetation removal through things like using pruning as opposed to removal, and also keeping things as permeable as possible, I think is good for buffers and good for floodplain management. And really thinking about how vegetation can help with nutrients. And last but not least is being an advocate for buffers and an advocate for good floodplain management. The people using these areas can definitely play a huge role in that. Next. And then one thing I wanted to mention as an opportunity, different kind of opportunity, is that a lot of the work that American Rivers has been doing on buffers and floodplain management in Pennsylvania has been working with the Pennsylvania Riparian Forest Buffer Advisory Committee, which is a committee that DCNR hosts. I just pulled this information off the website, but basically the Riparian Forested Buffer Advisory Committee is organized and coordinated by DCNR, and it's a group of professionals that's engaged in riparian forest buffer implementation, policy, and planning work. And the group meets quarterly to discuss all issues related to riparian forest buffers and helps to guide DCNR's direction for their buffer program. So if you're working on buffers and floodplain restoration work, this could be and you don't know about this resource in Pennsylvania, this could be something to check out. And they do have a subcommittee on floodplain restoration, which is where some folks like Josh and Eileen come together to talk about some of these issues. So next, I'm going to toss it over to Eileen.
All right, thanks. I'm going to wrap up by identifying a couple of the opportunities I'm seeing, and particularly the connection to the federal work that's happening. There's, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of growing support for more nature-based solutions to flooding. One of the new resources that FEMA just came out with is this guide on building community resilience with nature-based solutions. This is a great guidance document, includes a number of different examples of nature-based solutions that FEMA is supportive of and trying to fund more projects like these. I think there are still some challenges with the how the current regulations that Josh talked about and how they work together with some of these projects. But as I mentioned, that's an issue that we're trying to address at that national level in order to make sure that there's more alignment between some of the regulations and support for these projects that are all being implemented through FEMA. One thing that I could say, a way for folks on this this meeting is to get in touch with their floodplain managers. If you're looking for an opportunity to connect with them, reaching out to them and making sure they're aware of this guide might be a good way to provide that introduction and start exploring the opportunities that may exist in your neighborhood and in your community to implement nature-based solutions to flooding on a local level. Next slide. This guide that I mentioned was released in connection with a new pre-disaster mitigation program that FEMA is implementing this fall. It's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. It's going to have $500 million available this year. It's the first year it's receiving funding for planning and project funding for resilience projects. Very broad definition of resilience. So essentially anything that you can come up with that's going to improve resilience within your community is potentially eligible. One of the activities that FEMA is encouraging in their notice of funding is plan integration. So they want to see comprehensive plans, watershed plans, climate adaptation plans, etc., incorporated into local and state hazard mitigation plans. Those hazard mitigation plans are essentially the blueprint for how a local community and the state is going to invest in disaster mitigation and how they're going to spend some of their disaster funding that's available after a flood or some other natural disaster hits. So once you can get your nature-based solutions, including riparian buffers, included into those plans, there's going to be a better opportunity to align them with floodplain management, with disaster mitigation, and make sure that those buffer projects and those other restoration projects are aligned with the disaster mitigation that's happening. And if you want to learn more about BRIC, I'm going to copy that link into the chat after this, but you could feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about the opportunity that's available. The funding window is going to open at the end of the month. Next slide. And another potential activity to engage in, like I said, is this process of integrating nature-based solutions into your hazard mitigation plans. I want to mention EPA and FEMA have both been supporting pilot projects on this effort in West Virginia, New York, Oregon, in order to more efficiently spend their limited resources in a way that provides multiple benefits to a community. Next slide. American Rivers is planning to explore this opportunity at the Pennsylvania state level over the next few years. Our state hazard mitigation plan was updated in 2018 and will be updated again by 2023 because they have to be updated every 5 years. So we are going to be actively working to try and make sure that nature-based solutions, including buffers, trainings, and other efforts to improve coordination between conservationists and floodplain managers are integrated into that plan. So we are definitely looking for other partners to help with that effort and would love to see parallel efforts undertaken in local communities and in the other states within the Delaware Basin. I know that New York and New Jersey, I think their plans were just updated in 2019, and Delaware's was also in 2018. So you have a couple of years, if you're interested in this, to sort of get started before those plans will have to be updated again. Next slide. So that's all the slides we have for right now. So we're gonna have a little time for questions, but I hope we haven't scared too many people off from working in floodplains. I think our shared goal is to make sure that we have both healthy floodplains and that they're going to be safe for our communities throughout the basin. So I will stop talking so we can address some of these questions.
So it looks like we do have some questions in the chat box, and I'll just start with the ones that were put up there first. So here's one from Nathan Boone. It's, how might we think about investments for connectivity and waterfront access providing a temporary benefit, and what trade-offs are involved, knowing that access might be wiped out in 2100, but still provide decades of value in the interim?
Yeah, this is Josh. I'll take that one. It's important to do long-range planning and cost-benefit analysis, incorporating that science, that climate science, into projects and planning. To really make sure that the investments are going to be sound investments for the period of time when those areas aren't fully inundated. So investing $100 million in a trail system that by 2050 or 2100 is going to experience severe amounts of inundation may not be the most sound investment. It's also important to incorporate how you're going to close those trails in the event of a flood so that you're not risking the lives of the trail users, as well as maybe causing more damage to the trails. So those are just some of my initial thoughts there.
And I would just add on to that, I think, you know, the more that we can think about our sort of long-term plans for which properties need to be acquired, the most flood-prone properties that need to be acquired and relocated, elevated, and otherwise mitigated, and align those plans with the natural resources planning that's happening. You know, we're especially in those areas that are going to experience sea level rise. We're going to need to be able to migrate further inland, and so aligning that sort of disaster reduction planning with the conservation initiatives will should help to provide more of a path that both parties are working together to move that forward.
So there's another question in the chat from Julie Schneider about coordination process, but it looks like Eileen's already answered that. If that's not the case, please post again and we'll come back to that one. But the next question then is from Rachel Dawson. Could either Josh or Eileen comment on key features and considerations of really good floodplain restoration or riparian buffer restoration projects? In other words, what are the kinds of practices and steps that successful projects tend to incorporate and execute really well? And she also says, thank you for the great presentations.
Well, one of the things when we're talking about floodplains in particular, if you want to have a functional floodplain, so one that you're maximizing all of those natural benefits, we look to plan for 4 key attributes. So you want to make sure that your floodplain is connected to the river. So, you know, reducing levees, reducing the other physical human-made structures that prevent water from getting onto the floodplain during high water. Second is flows. So you want to have flows on the floodplain that are as natural as possible. And timing, you want to look at things like timing, what time of the year that's happening. You want to look at how long the floodplain is going to be inundated, what depth it's being inundated. And that's all really key to the species that you are looking to restore habitat for. You know, there's some fish that need to be on the floodplain at a certain time of the year for, you know, at least a certain amount of time in order to be able to reproduce. So understanding those key requirements of the species you're interested in and the flow that's needed can be really important in planning a good project. Second is habitat and structural diversity. So we don't want to see uniform, you know, flat lands on a floodplain necessarily. You know, there's often going to be variation in some higher lands, some wetlands. When you are looking to reduce nutrients or using floodplains to reduce nutrient pollution from a river system, having a standing wetland is really important because that ensures that the microbes that are really important in that chemical process are there. And so that when the floodplain is inundated, they are able to, you know, sort of explode and do their job of pulling those nutrients out of the water column. And then the fourth consideration is to look at spatial scale. You know, if you're looking at a larger river, you want to have a larger area of natural floodplain in order to generate those attributes. But if you are working in your higher headwaters, you know, obviously your floodplain doesn't need to be as large. But connectivity along the river can be just as important to make sure that you're achieving those benefits. So that is probably way more technical information that you need to know, but we have a full report on that American Rivers developed that I can link to if anybody's interested in reading more about that technical resources there.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to add two quick things from a floodplain management perspective. Connecting the design and the engineering, making sure you're doing those H&H studies. Believe it or not, I've seen stream restoration projects actually increase base flood elevations and negatively impact adjacent properties. So you definitely want to reduce that or eliminate that as much as possible. But connecting the design and engineering is vitally important.
Yeah, that was a good lead-in question too, to this other question from Alex Ambrose, which is, can you talk about choosing vegetation in riparian buffer and floodplain projects?
Oh, you are going beyond my area of expertise there, that's for sure. I would definitely defer to maybe your local NRCS contacts or folks that are more essentially you want to look at whatever the native floodplain vegetation is for the location that you are working in. So I would turn to whoever your experts are in a local area on the vegetation that grows in your region.
And this next question is from Sue Myroth, asks about any tips for maintaining these restoration efforts.
Well, I can say from our perspective, you know, in general, when we're trying to restore natural floodplains, we want them to be self-maintaining. So you want to design a project that's going to, in its natural condition, you wouldn't necessarily need that much maintenance. However, in reality, and particularly when we're talking about urban areas, you know, you definitely need to accommodate for and plan for some long-term maintenance. I think part of the challenge in a lot of communities is that, you know, it's left to the local municipality workers to maintain some of these more public park areas. So that's why we often end up with a lot of just turf that needs to be mowed regularly, and maybe some resistance to planting buffers and doing more natural conditions. So the challenge then is to make sure that we are working with the local municipalities on a maintenance plan that recognizes the need to maintain more natural vegetation. And if we're in a floodplain in a more urban area, we probably need to include something like how we're going to deal with trees that and debris, so that it's not going to be shifting the floodwaters towards a more developed area. And Josh can definitely talk more to that need.
Yeah, specifically in urban areas, maintenance of trash and fallen debris is extremely important. Also, those accessory structures, I can't stress enough, they become buoyant and can damage downstream bridges and even stream restoration projects. So it's extremely important to be vigilant about the entirety of that watershed and that floodplain, so you don't have floating objects damaging trees and vegetation downstream as well. So it's a very holistic approach.
And I see another question coming, or a comment here about the that riparian buffers get wiped out after one big flood. I can say that the DCNR advisory group that's working on riparian and floodplain issues is looking at you know, some best practices for planting buffers in floodplains in order to make sure that the trees survive and that they are planting the right vegetation that can withstand regular flooding. So I'm not sure what the timing is on that, but I know that there is efforts underway to provide some guidance, at least to Pennsylvania communities on that.
So Jonathan Milne asks how has floodplain restoration methodology evolved in the face of increased precipitation events?
That is a great question. I think that isn't necessarily something that has that I've seen be addressed directly, in part because floodplain restoration and floodplains in general are intended to experience flooding and on a somewhat regular basis. So I think the design of your project and the sort of particularly the types of vegetation need to consider how that vegetation can withstand regular flooding, and how frequently that occurs, whether it's every year or whether it's every 25 years, that's going to make a big difference. So I know in some places that have been experiencing changes like that, they have seen some trees dying off because they're being flooded more often than they have in the past. So it's sort of that long-term maintenance that you might have to plan for some succession, and go back in and change out the types of trees that you're planting. There's a group in California in the Central Valley called River Partners that is what they do, is they plant trees in floodplains. And so they have a lot of great resources and guides on that practice, and how they go about choosing which trees that they're going to use, and make sure that they have sort of a strategy for how that system is going to evolve over time. That might be useful in thinking about that sort of long-term change due to precipitation.
Yeah, it's also important to note the science, the mapping, and the modeling is constantly evolving. That's where it gets back to that coordination piece, making sure you're reaching out to the water department, the floodplain manager, the Army Corps, the DEP. They might have new rain gauge data. They might have other gauge data that is representative of the new increased precipitation. So incorporating as much of that new and evolving climate science is very important.
So the next question is there a Delaware River Basin specific guidance on coordinating wood additions to streams? This comes from Keith Fritchie. Sorry, Keith, if I just got your name wrong.
I'm not sure about that. So if anybody knows, then please speak up in the chat.
And I do want to check in with Kelly, because I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but it looks like we still have lots of questions. Should we just keep going, or do we need to wrap it up?
Yeah, the next session isn't until 1 p.m., so there is time.
Okay, so this next one, another one from Nate Boone. How can we make the best case for flood storage value of natural infrastructure relative to traditional reservoir systems, especially at the scale of large watershed systems? For example, DRBC's reservoir system provides hundreds of billions of gallons of storage. Thoughts?
Good question. There is a program, it's a partnership between TNC and the Army Corps called Sustainable Rivers Program. And one of the work that they do is essentially look at creating more natural flow conditions in rivers that have big reservoir systems. So they look at altering the timing of releases in order to maintain more natural flows. Part of that effort, I know, has been to try and restore more natural floodplain conditions, because that's another way that floodplains can be disconnected, is if you have reservoir systems that are prohibiting natural flood peaks during the spring or whenever you would naturally see them, then you are going to see a loss of that floodplain habitat because they aren't experiencing inundation on a regular basis. So if we can recreate environmental flows within the river, then you can at least see a somewhat regular inundation of, say, the 5% annual chance flood, or So, we're not looking at huge areas and under those huge flood conditions, but more seasonal flooding that actually is some of the most diverse and beneficial floodplain habitat. So that might be something, if there aren't efforts like that happening already in the Delaware, might be something worth exploring.
This next question from Holly Schwab is, where do the presenters see that land protection can have the most impact in mitigating flood hazard within the basin, and what factors are most important for targeting protection for mitigation?
I could take this one. This is something I think
Yeah,
about
go ahead, Josh.
as a floodplain manager, and if I could wave my magic wand. We definitely need to be looking at climate science and sea level rise, increased precipitation. We need to find a way how to regulate to certain levels of that climate science. For instance, in Philadelphia, we allow development to occur in these areas that we know are going to be inundated up to 26 times a year or fully inundated by 2050 or 2100 today. We do have some advisory downsampled science, but we don't act upon that. It's not implementable in terms of regulations or codes or even long-range planning. So step one is to look at climate science. It's very important to reestablish natural floodplains, looking at retreat methods, buying out properties, reestablishing those floodplains and removing the risk entirely of properties located that are getting constantly damaged. Because those people that live in those homes, they're just losing property value, they're losing property contents, and it's kind of untenable for them to continue to live there. So really investing into those programs, like the Blue Acres program in New Jersey is a great example that really could work well in Pennsylvania. And I have to say this as well. We need investment. We need political support here in Pennsylvania. We have one NFIP coordinator for the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we represent 10% of the National Flood Insurance Program in the country. So there is a huge lack of investment at the state level, as well as coordination with other state grant programs, such as the RCAP or the RACP program. They often give redevelopment grants in floodplains, and not just floodplains, but high-risk floodplains, such as floodways. So really asking the politicians and the state government to really reinvest into the flood risk and how to mitigate those flood risks.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Josh just said. I would also mention, like, there are some states across the country that are fully implementing, or I should say, fully integrating their flood management and their river conservation and habitat restoration efforts at a programmatic level. So you look at states like Vermont or Washington State, they have their flood insurance and their floodplain management staff and disaster assistance staff sitting in the same offices and the same programs as their river conservation staff. And in that way, they can take a more holistic look and more holistic approach to how they're managing their rivers. And in Pennsylvania, it's very siloed. We're really just starting to see some integration and good communication between, say, DCNR and our, they have a river protection program. They have investment in river planning, and it's not always coordinated with our FEMA, Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. We're just starting to see that connection and that communication on a regular basis. So, I think there's a lot that can be done to create much more integration between our state agencies in order to create more holistic river management, for sure.
Okay, so this may be our last question. As we chart future climate pattern expectations to address climate change for our projects, how large or small a region do we need to examine for those climate and weather pattern predictions?
Yeah, I often get this question about scale. When you're looking at climate predictions, you really need that downsampled data. to really act on it. I know when you work as a floodplain manager or work in local permitting, you really need actionable science that is really downsampled to a parcel level. So it can be extremely challenging when that does not exist. We're fortunate enough to have that in Philadelphia, but that is not the case everywhere. But you can at least use it as a roadmap and guidelines if it is a much broader scale, to really just understand the risk and plan for those. You might not be able to design for specific risks, but you can at least plan and think about how you can incorporate that into projects.
Okay, I think that's it. I'll just note that there are some things in the chat about the next session coming up and how to give feedback on the session. But otherwise, I want to really thank Eileen and Josh for great presentations and a lot of really good information, and everybody else for all the questions. So it's been a great session, and I think that wraps it up for us. Anything else on your end, Kelly?
No, thank you all. This is great. We will post the recording next week, and feel free to check Sketch for any remainder events today. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.